Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to tonight's Generation 180 event, Electrifying Virginia's Transportation Policies. If you're here to learn more about the types of policies that can support transportation electrification in the Commonwealth, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're looking forward to hearing from a great panel of experts passionate in their fields. Lena Lewis from the Nature Conservancy, Walton Shepherd from the National Resources Defense Council, and our very own Blair St. Ledger-Olson from Generation 180. We're thrilled to have such knowledgeable speakers as our panelists this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, I want to tell you briefly about Generation 180. We're a national nonprofit organization based in Charlottesville, Virginia, working to inspire and equip individuals to take action on clean energy. My name is Stuart Gardner, and I'm your host for tonight. A special thank you to our team member, Nate McFarland, working behind the scenes, supporting this event. Here's a quick look at the three major focus areas of our work. We're working to flip the energy script, helping us move from a narrative focused on climate doom and gloom to a story focused on where we need to go, a world powered by 100% clean energy. A story that says we can do this and we all have a role to play. We focus on individuals in their homes and communities because your energy matters. Certain behaviors and technologies not only help fight climate change, but they also help build the social momentum and political will we need to get big system level changes. We lead two major nationwide campaigns, Solar for All Schools, which just released their 2020 Brighter Future report, and Electrify Your Ride, which works to make EVs more accessible. Solar and EVs are clean energy solutions proven to address two of the largest sources of carbon dioxide, emissions from electricity generation and transportation. Today, Generation 180 released the Virginia Drives Electric report. Some of the key findings are sampled here. Our report shows that there is demand for electric vehicles in the Commonwealth, but there are barriers holding back the transition to electric transportation. Tonight, we're going to talk about the policies Virginia needs to address some of these barriers. A few quick housekeeping items before we start. Because of the number of people joining us this evening, all attendees will remain on mute throughout the event. Please use your Q&A, not the chat, to submit questions, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So without further ado, let's hear a little bit from our guests. Do you want to kick us off, Walton?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for joining everyone who I can't see, where I wish I could. My name is Walton Shepard. I'm here in Richmond, Virginia. I am an EV owner myself, and I have plenty of funny anecdotes about funny and telling anecdotes about EV ownership that I'm sure lots of other people have similar stories as well. As I said, I live in Richmond, working for the Natural Resources Defense Council on state level climate policy. Which is primarily transportation related these days for reasons we'll get into. I grew up in West Virginia. My grandfather was born in a coal camp. I started out my career in book publishing, of all things. Then I moved into being a school teacher. And then when Barack Obama was elected president, I felt inspired to start working on climate change as an issue. Went back to law school back in my home state of West Virginia, and then moved to Washington, D.C. to work for NRDC, working on more national policy issues. And then a few years ago, I made the great move down I-95 100 miles to Richmond, which is where I reside now with my dog Blanche. And as I mentioned earlier, my EV, I have a black Chevy Volt. So I'm thrilled to join this group. I am always inspired by people who are engaged on their own time, and are not being paid an hourly wage to do so, because it's folks that are doing that actually bring about real policy change way more than the people that are paid an hourly wage to do it. So I really am honored to be among folks that are so dedicated. So thanks for joining.
Thanks so much for being part of the panel tonight. Lena, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Lena Lewis with the Nature Conservancy, and likewise wish I could see you all out there, but glad you're here. Thanks for joining us. I am based in Charlottesville, Virginia, and just a little bit on my background then. Like Walton, I was a school teacher. I taught high school biology and environmental science, and cared very much about sustainability, and felt like science wasn't enough. Understanding science wasn't enough to get us to make the changes that we wanted to make, and I needed to understand economics and public policy and political science. So a few years ago, I went to my local university, University of Virginia, to study public policy. And now I work at the Nature Conservancy here in Charlottesville in my dream job. So if you're not familiar with the Nature Conservancy, I'll just take a minute to tell you about that. The Nature Conservancy is a nonprofit. We're an international organization. We work to protect the lands and waters on which all life depends. We do so through many methods, including directly acquiring land in order to protect the wildlife living on it. We conduct scientific research. We partner with government agencies, local communities, corporations, all to protect land and marine ecosystems far beyond the borders of the properties that we own. And we protect a lot of amazing ecosystems around the world, but I just, out of Virginia pride, I just want to share a couple with you that we have right here in Virginia that are pretty special. So if you wouldn't mind putting up the first slide, thank you. This is a picture of the Clinch Valley in Southwest Virginia. Southwest Virginia is coal country. There's been a lot of mountaintop removal there, but as you can see, there's a lot still left that's there to save. This is a surprising hotspot in biodiversity. The Nature Conservancy manages thousands of acres of forest along with sections of the Clinch River to maintain that high biodiversity, and in doing so provides many benefits, including increased carbon sequestration from the atmosphere. And the next slide is on the other side of this wonderful state. We also care for 14 barrier and marsh islands of Eastern Virginia. Our preserve is the longest expanse of coastal wilderness remaining on the East Coast. And it has become painfully clear that effectively protecting special ecosystems like these means tackling climate change. That's why climate action is a priority for the Nature Conservancy, and that's where I come in, along with a lot of my colleagues around the world. I focus on energy and climate policy in Virginia, and that means I've been focusing on advocating for better energy efficiency. Cleanest energy is the energy we never need. And I also work on reducing carbon dioxide pollution from our transportation sector, which is why I'm here with you this evening. And so on the next slide, if you would. So you may have heard that transportation is the largest source of carbon dioxide pollution in Virginia. When you look at the breakdown of where that carbon dioxide pollution is coming from different types of transportation, from our large trucks, from small vehicles, what is very clear is that we have well over the majority of that transportation emission carbon pollution is coming from personal vehicles, cars, SUVs, light duty trucks. And we hear a lot about the need to decarbonize the power sector, but collectively our cars and trucks emit more carbon dioxide than all of Virginia's power plants combined. So that's why I focus on carbon pollution from transportation. And it's imperative that as a part of that solution, we look at getting more EVs adopted quickly. Thank you.
Thanks. And Blair, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I wish I didn't have to follow these two, gosh. Well, like Lena and Stuart, I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm actually an environmental scientist turned advocate, and I work with Stuart Gardner on our Electrify Your Ride campaign, as well as on our advocacy development content. So as we're here today to talk about Virginia policy, Virginia is our hometown. Even though Gen 180 is a national organization, we really believe in the power of the Commonwealth, how Virginia can be a leader, and it's time to be a leader in transportation emissions as far as I think we're all concerned. So just like Stuart said earlier during his presentation, today we released the Virginia Drives Electric report, and it's got some great policy recommendations, a few of which we're going to talk about tonight. And even though tonight we're going to try to talk about mostly electrifying personal vehicles on the road, I think it's fair to say every one of us here also thinks that we need to think really broadly about reforming our transportation system as a whole. And this is just step one in getting there to really support the Commonwealth's carbon reduction goals.
Thanks, Blair.
That's my spiel.
Yeah. So let's start with a quick overview of what EV policy looks like in the Commonwealth. Lena, does Virginia even have any EV related policies, good or bad? Help us kind of level set.
We do not have much in the way of EV policies in Virginia. The good is that now your HOA or condo association cannot deny you from putting an EV charger in your designated parking spot. So that's a nice little hurdle that's not there anymore. In terms of other support, there's not a lot there. The bad is that we have an EV fee now that EV owners need to pay $88 a year. The rationale for that is that if you own an EV, you are not paying any gas taxes, and those gas taxes are needed to build and maintain roads. So that's about it. There's a lot more that could be done to support EV ownership in Virginia.
Thanks for that. You know, if for the most part, Virginia doesn't have any policies, at least encouraging electric vehicles, why is it important to do this now? Why is it a change needed? Walton, you want to talk about why that is? Why is it important to change?
Sure. I mean, in a simple two-word answer, because it's time. We mentioned earlier that there's more pollution coming from our personal vehicles than from all of the state's smokestacks for power plants. You know, folks, I imagine folks on this call tonight are relatively well informed individuals, and probably are aware that we've largely dealt in Virginia with power plant pollution. Last year or earlier this year, there was the Virginia Clean Economy Act. And you know, we are going to go to zero carbon from power plants by 2050, about a million ton pollution reduction per year out to 2050, going to zero and staying at zero. So we've largely, you know, taken care of that. And there's a reason even though it's a lower source of pollution than transportation, there's a reason we took care of that first. Smokestacks are easier to point to and identify and say that's where we need to reduce the pollution. There's only so many power plants in the state, whereas there's millions of tailpipes in our state that are all emitting pollution as well. It's harder to get to millions of tailpipes. The other reason is there were ready solutions for reducing pollution from power plants. Energy efficiency, wind power, solar power, those are all things that people want. It's technology that's here. So, but now that we've taken care of the power sector moving forward, it's time to get to the bigger source, but also in a lot of ways that historically has been the more complicated source, because again, we're talking millions of tailpipes. But the reason it's time is not only the urgency of climate change, it's the solutions are now here. Electric vehicles are here. Now, are they getting delivered to Virginia yet? No, and we're going to talk about that. Do we have chargers at a sufficient level that people feel confident buying and a relatively cost parity electric vehicle yet? No, we don't. But we know that charging technology exists. We know that EVs exist. It's just a matter of bringing those solutions into Virginia, and that's where policy comes in, of course.
Yeah, yeah. Anything to add there, Blair or Lena? Why is it important for this change?
I would say that, you know, we just need to build on those political wins that we had in 2020. And I really do recognize that coronavirus and this pandemic have set some unforeseen speed bumps in that transition that we're all just going to have to work around. But at the end of the day, we only have so many years and to really make a difference, and Virginia can play a role in that, and so we need to keep on chugging.
So that's kind of a good segue talking about wins. You know, we passed a pretty substantial bill about addressing electricity generation, Virginia Clean Economy Act. Blair, does that support EVs at all? What's the relationship there?
Yeah, and so as Walton mentioned, the Virginia Clean Economy Act worked to decarbonize our power sector. But even with today's electricity mix in the Commonwealth, EVs actually create up to 70% less carbon dioxide emissions compared to a similar gas-powered vehicle. So right now, if you hear the response, oh, but it's just charged by coal. One, no, it's not. Two, even if it was, it's still cleaner. EVs are cleaner across the board in every state in the country right now. So combining EVs with a clean energy power grid it's a win-win, because EVs with net zero electricity generation takes that 70% number to 100%. So EVs, as we continue to clean up our grid, as we honor our Virginia Clean Economy Act mandates, are going to get cleaner and cleaner every day. And you cannot say that for ICE vehicles. You know, I know advocates who love to remind folks that your EV will always get cleaner. Your EV will start to get more efficient as we clean up our grid. Your ICE vehicles, miles per gallon, is never going to change.
Yep, great point. I want to talk about some specific policies, but before we do, what are some of the current barriers impacting EV adoptions that, you know, some of the policies we're going to talk about later, what will they address? What are some of those barriers that policies can work toward? Want to hear from each of you. Walton, you want to start?
Sure. And the good news is there are solutions to each of these barriers. The number one, and this is sort of the personal anecdote I alluded to earlier, is supply chain. There's desire and interest in EVs. I have enough that I bought one, but there was only one in the Richmond market. And when I went to the dealership to ask, I'm interested in buying this Volt, they couldn't locate it on the lot. It was in the back of the lot covered in leaves. I'm not exaggerating. They had to wash it quickly to bring it out. And the salesman, who was sort of tasked with me, that was assigned to me, didn't know it was an electric vehicle. He literally did not know. I had to tell him that he was embarking on selling me an electric vehicle. And so not only was there only one vehicle available, the dealership didn't know anything about it. They even didn't even know they had it. So it's a supply chain issue that starts at the auto manufacturer level. They're sending them somewhere, but they're not coming to Virginia. I think we do have to be realistic that there is still a remaining cost differential. Mainly battery costs are still coming down, but not quite reaching cost parity. So there are solutions to that, and most projections see cost parity with traditional vehicles this decade. And then range anxiety. I think we have to be realistic that people do not yet feel comfortable until they see charging infrastructure, on a sort of like visible, regular awareness level. Folks are always going to be nervous about buying a car because, I can't take that road trip to the beach. It's good for around town, but how am I going to get to, location X? So those all have solutions, though, and that's the good news.
Blair, Lena, any other barriers you want to mention as far as impacting EV adoption?
Well, I think Walton just ticked off all of them really effectively. Thanks for leaving something for the rest of us. But, one thing I would add to that is, yes, price parity is an issue. We want to talk about how to address that later tonight. Hopefully it's all the estimates right now say that between 2024 and 2027 is when that's going to be even though we know that ownership of an EV is way less than ownership of an ICE car. That upfront cost differential is still a barrier. And then something you say, Stuart, all the time that I think is really apt is that owning an EV actually cures range anxiety. You start to realize that you have more range than you think you do in terms of none of us drive as far as we think we do. And if there is that weekend trip, Virginia is investing in an infrastructure. It needs to continue being built out, but that's going to be there to match. There are those solutions coming, as well as you can rent a car. I'm just throwing that out there. You are always welcome to rethink how you take that beach trip. But really your everyday EVs can just be a perfect daily driver for so many people.
That's so true.
I just want to, point out in terms of the upfront cost, that is a barrier for most car purchases. Most people, when they go and buy a car, have an upfront cost barrier, and that has been solved with financing. And, so I just wonder how much we think that barrier is insurmountable when in fact the tools to solve that were figured out a long time ago and just need to be tweaked to accommodate the specifics of EVs.
Yeah, we're not reinventing the wheel here, are we? We're just bringing the things we know work to Virginia.
Yeah, and in terms of range anxiety, I just wanted to share, because I got to hear a presentation by the Rocky Mountain Institute, Chris Nelder, who's an expert in EV charging infrastructure. And he talked about how people refer to the EVs and the charging infrastructure as a chicken and egg problem. Like, People don't want to buy the EVs until the charging infrastructure is there, and you don't want to have the charging infrastructure until there are EVs to use it. And he said, you know what, it's not a chicken and egg problem. If EVs are the chicken, we have a chicken and waffle problem. The chicken is here, the EVs are here. We're waffling about charging infrastructure.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think Lena wins the analogy.
Yeah, she does.
This evening.
Well, as I say, it wasn't mine, but I liked it, so I wanted to pass it on.
Yeah. Yeah. Lena, you know, Walton alluded to inventory being an issue, and we also found that in the analysis we did in the Virginia Drives Electric report. Can you help us understand the Advanced Clean Car Standards program, I think also referred to commonly as ZEV? How does that help to address the issue of vehicle availability and this inventory problem that we hear about?
Yeah, ZEV is a very effective policy fix that we can implement here in Virginia. So I want to take a couple minutes to describe that. ZEV standing for Zero Emission Vehicles, which for the most part means electric vehicles, but also leaves room for other technologies like hydrogen fuel cells, and also accounts for hybrid plug-in electric vehicles. So I have a couple slides here just because I like visuals. So these states in blue are states that have adopted the Zero Emission Vehicle Standard, or the ZEV standard. And so for states that have the ZEV standard, a small percent of each manufacturer's sales in the ZEV state has to be zero emission or hybrid plug-in electric vehicles. And then that percent grows over time. This is a very achievable percent. For example, for these ZEV states, for model year 2025, manufacturers will need to sell roughly 8% of their vehicles, their new vehicles, as ZEV vehicles, EVs. It's important to note that customers in ZEV states still have a full array of choice of all of the conventional gas-powered vehicles if they want them. They just also, in addition, have access to more types of EV models at more price points. So ZEV is a way to increase accessibility to EVs. The reason for that is because the manufacturers, which are national, decide which states they're going to send their EVs to, and they prioritize the states that have this ZEV standard. So, you know, Maryland, if you live there, you have access to many more types of EVs than you do if you live in Virginia. And the difference is simply that Maryland is a ZEV state. So that's a fix that we can do here. You can go to the next slide. This map kind of tells that story a little bit. This is showing where EVs are registered across Virginia. And you can see that, you know, the bulk of them are in Northern Virginia. And you could say, well, that's where the people who want the EVs live. But I don't think it's quite that simple. And certainly Generation 180's research and that they published today demonstrates that. If we have over half of people who would consider buying an EV for their next vehicle, what's going to make them make that choice? You know, what we want to see is that when people decide they're ready to buy a new car, when they go to the dealership, the obvious best choice for them is an electric vehicle, that they decide that's for me, right? And what's going to make that happen? You know, Walton's story is typical, and if there are those of you out there that have similar stories, you know, it'd be great for us to collect those, because that's not unusual. Right, and if you're not as persistent as Walton or many of the people who I suspect are on this call, you're not going to get that EV. The reason that people in Northern Virginia are purchasing more of these vehicles is a lot of them are driving over the border to Maryland, where they have access to all of these models. And for those of us who aren't in Northern Virginia, it's not fair. We want access to those vehicles too. We want to see them in our dealerships, and so that's why this ZEV mandate is so important for Virginia. And so the next and last slide. Okay, so General Assembly for Virginia will begin in January. It'll be brief, it'll end in February. We support clean cars legislation for Virginia, and that has two components. One is the ZEV component, to increase customer choice and access, to increase the diversity of electric vehicle models that you can buy in Virginia. And also it's to send a message to the manufacturers who, you know, like most businesses, want to make the sure bet. And as they're deciding what do we invest in as we come out of this COVID recession, they could say, well, it seems like people really want to keep with their traditional gas-powered vehicles, let's keep making them. Or they could say, you know what, the future is here, let's really shift all of our focus and invest full throttle, no pun intended, into electric vehicles. And the more states that take on that ZEV adoption, the more the manufacturers are going to get that message. And then one more click on that slide. There's another component to this clean cars legislation for people who want to buy traditional gas-powered vehicles, still can. Those vehicles will have a low emission vehicle standard. So on average, they will be emitting lower levels of pollution, and that will have climate benefits. It'll have immediate health benefits for people living near roadways, and it'll save the drivers money on gasoline.
That's an awesome overview. You know, you hear so much about ZEV and people just say ZEV and expect everyone to know what that is. So really appreciate that. That's great. You know, one of the barriers you guys talked about as well is that higher upfront cost. Blair, what kind of policies can help address that?
Sure. Well, one, I would just like to say that Lena's very clear description of the Advanced Clean Car Program indicates how amazing of a biology professor she must have been. So thank you, Lena, for that very thorough and detailed analysis.
Yep.
I feel like I've learned something. But right, Stuart, you know, we say we want to increase access. That doesn't just mean bringing the cars here. It means making them attainable for people as well, and in particular for low to moderate income communities. So we know there's still, hopefully only for a few more years, but still a price difference between these two cars, hopefully coming down between 2024 and 2027. But there's a gap, and we need to help more people deal with that gap. So the Center for Sustainable Energy actually has a statistic that over 40% of electric vehicles purchased throughout the country have been due to financial incentives at the state level. And there's studies that show how just a $1,000 state level incentive can actually lead to over a 7% increase in electric vehicles in that state. So when we look at how a point of sale EV rebate could really help communities who need help the most go electric, and how that could help us bridge the gap between ZEV and the Advanced Clean Car Program. And right now, looking more holistically at how these policies work, I think is key. So bringing down that, I think as the manufacturer community refers to it, on the hood incentives that really help at the purchase price.
Right.
It also helps create a broad used vehicle market. So does ZEV, for instance.
Yeah. Walton, you know, we talk a lot about statewide policies. What about regional efforts? You know, one of the things that people talk about is the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI. Can you help us understand what that is and how that works and why people should care about it?
Yeah, so just touching on our last comments here, you know, so ZEV gets at the rifle shot issue of more supply of EVs. Incentives are a narrow rifle shot at creating demand or easing access on the demand side, the purchaser side of things. The Transportation and Climate Initiative is a regional effort that gets at, if we're interested in reducing this largest source of carbon emissions in Virginia, it gets directly at reducing total carbon emissions from the transportation sector, while also addressing direct funding of the things that improve emissions, such as funding incentives or funding charging infrastructure. And essentially the way it works is it's a cap and invest program where you cap the total pollution that is allowed to occur from gasoline and diesel, and you get it at the wholesale level. So you say to a wholesaler, you are responsible for a certain amount of downstream pollution from the product you're selling. And you therefore must pay for allowances that keep it below the total cap, and that is reduced over time, ideally, ultimately to zero. That's how we're doing it for the power sector. That's how we're reducing carbon emissions to zero by 2050 in the power sector, is capping and reducing. And then the investment component of the Transportation and Climate Initiative is dispersing those funds to the states that participate, and this would be a multi-state participation, from all the way from Virginia, hopefully up to Maine. We'll see if Maine joins in or not, but mostly northeastern states. And the states can, frankly, invest the proceeds however they choose to do so. But if the states are smart, they'll invest in things that further reduce carbon emissions. For example, the best example is transit. But on the personal vehicle side, it would be investing in charging infrastructure so people feel comfortable. So there's no more waffling on charging infrastructure, and things like cash on the hood incentives to close the cost gap, again, especially for low to moderate income would-be first-time car buyers. So we're at an early stage. Governor Northam did sign on to the early early stages of kind of fleshing out what the program would look like. It also took many years to do the power plant or power sector program, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So it's not something you do overnight because many states are involved. We're hoping that Governor Northam will take the next step in proceeding with the process, and ultimately it would require the legislature to sign off as well. But we're at least a year off from that, just given where this initiative is in the process. But it's really exciting, and particularly from very significant funding levels. I mean, everything we want to do in the transportation sector can get a serious boost from the level of funding that would be available from essentially charging polluters for the pollution they cause.
Can I ask a question of Walton?
Yeah.
I'm going rogue, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So the TCI MOU, it's supposed to come out at the end of this year, right? That's the next step for the Commonwealth?
That's the next step, and we're really, urging Governor Northam to sign the memorandum of understanding with other states to say, yes, we're in this together. The more states that are in, the better the program will work. You don't need every state that's contemplated to join. You just need a critical mass for the program to work. They don't even need to be contiguous states. So we should hear by December whether Northam is in it to win it, and we're hopeful he is.
For both Walton, that's an excellent overview. Our Q&A kind of lit up with Lena talking about ZEV and you talking about TCI. What is the likelihood that Virginia becomes a ZEV state, and what is the likelihood that we sign the MOU for TCI? Is there a way to predict that, or say, what end of the spectrum? You shake the magic 8 ball.
I'm just going
signs point to
look into my crystal ball and
yeah. Any way to?
A lot of that depends on people that are listening in on this call and how much we can tell our elected officials that we want these. And ZEV and TCI and EV rebates all work very well together. We need to convey to them that we need the whole package. I think I don't want to be too optimistic, but I think there's a reasonable chance if we all make a concerted effort to make our voices heard, that this is the year that we need to pass ZEV, partially because it has a 2-year wait period before manufacturers have to comply. So that by the time TCI is enacted, it would be great to have ZEV already online for Virginia as well. And I think TCI I'd be curious to hear what Blair and Walton think on this. I think that's going to be require a big push from advocates and grassroots efforts as well, because it's going to have to go through our legislature, and it will require people spending some money, and sometimes people balk at that. But this is money that needs to be spent so that a lot of really important things can happen for our state, and this money will stimulate our economy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris Bass from DEQ has repeatedly said this, and I think it really holds true. Those of us in these organizations could advocate for these policies until we're blue in the face. But if real honest to God Virginians aren't beating down the door of their legislator to get them passed, our efforts are moot. So, we genuinely need real people to play a role in our transition to clean energy.
That's great. we've heard about incentives, we've heard about TCI, we've heard about ZEV. Blair, is one of those better than the other, or is it a combined approach? What's the best cocktail for this solution?
Oh God, asking if one policy is better than the other with a bunch of policy junkies or fighting words, Stuart. But just like climate change doesn't have a silver bullet, neither does climate policy. It really does take a holistic approach. And just as Lena was saying, ZEV is going to, even if we passed it in 2021, it would be a few years before it actually made a difference in the electric vehicle market in Virginia. And so when you combine ZEV with things like an equitably designed point of sale EV rebate, when you combine it with TCI, when you combine it with looking at transportation electrification as a whole and addressing other sectors where we can as well, that's the more holistic approach to this problem. And I truly think that that is the right path forward. I don't think we can wait long enough for ZEV to drive on its own adoption rate. I don't think we can wait long enough for TCI on its own to bring down carbon emissions through a cap and trade program. I don't think EV rebates on their own will solve our inventory problem. The three of these things kind of work like three legs of a stool, and they're powerful on their own, but they're so much more powerful together.
That's fantastic. Thank you. This one's for everyone. How do you increase access to electric vehicles for low to moderate income communities? It sounds like, hey, great for the people in Northern Virginia. What about everyone else? Do these policies help disadvantaged communities? Lena, do you want to start with that?
Yes, I think the important thing is that as we start to get more EVs into the market here, we will eventually start to get more pre-owned EVs available for sale, and that's where the affordability really gets ratcheted up, and that's where lower and moderate income communities can take advantage. I think it's also important to be realistic that for a lot of people, owning a car of any kind is just out of reach, and that's going to remain the case no matter what kind of rebates we have available for EVs. But having those rebates available for used EVs would be a way to help make them more affordable as well.
Great point.
Absolutely,
Walton,
and that is.
Or Blair, yeah.
Sorry, just really quickly to follow on what Lena just said, that is absolutely a part of what those of us who are advocating for EV rebates agree with wholeheartedly, that rebate needs to also be available for used vehicles. Lena's absolutely right. The used vehicle market is really a key point in helping more communities access electric vehicle technology.
Yeah,
Walton,
it's a good gap to identify. Not to repeat ourselves, there is a push to ensure that the TCI initiative, at least 35% of the proceeds from the polluters goes in some form or fashion to disadvantaged communities, which could in theory include low or potentially even moderate income EV either purchasers, owners, chargers. So I flag that for consideration, that there is disadvantaged communities deal with transportation pollution more than most in a lot of ways, not necessarily in rural communities, but in urban communities. If folks are familiar with Richmond, 95 goes right through, some of the more low income areas of Richmond. So, there is that sort of early commitment to saying, as we disperse these, future proceeds, let's make sure that a solid chunk of it goes to that. And that can include many of the things that Blair was describing on the incentive side. I also think there's going to be a gap in charging infrastructure in low to moderate income communities. I think the utilities can play a role in that. Utilities already have built environment infrastructure to support charging infrastructure in places that the private market is not going to go. The private market is not going to go to affordable housing units to put in charging infrastructure. There's just, more, business sense to go in other places, including in Richmond. The most convenient charging station to me is the one at the Whole Foods grocery store. So, the utilities are going to be in a good position to fill those charging infrastructure gaps. So we're hoping that there can be positive engagement on that front, and that goes to accountability at the State Corporation Commission, which of course see the larger investor-owned utilities in Virginia.
Great points. All great points. The we read forecasts that say as early as 2027, the cost of a battery will be about the same. You'll reach cost parity, what they say, with ICE. So why not wait till 2027 or 2030? Like, why do we need to be talking about this now? I would love to hear everyone's perspective.
You just crushed the scientist within me. We can't afford to wait that long. Like, really, that's just the blunt answer. Is for our climate goals, we can't afford to push off reducing transportation emissions for 7 years. And it would also not be in line with what Virginia has set as goals overall to be a leader in the clean energy sector. And I don't know if Lena or Walton have further thoughts on that, but to me, it's just, we can't afford to wait.
Yeah, I would say, Virginia has a unique position of being an incredibly educated, forward-leaning state on so many fronts. But we have a legacy policy system in Virginia, and on a variety of levels. And in this case, when it comes to, a combination of transportation, climate, the desire to address climate change, utility business model, we're still sort of stuck almost in the last century on so many areas. I think, in addition to Blair's point, I think it's because Virginia's ready for this. We are actually, on a sort of per capita basis, if you will, a relatively progressive state. So there's no reason to still be kind of stuck in the, last century's policy environment. 35% of the state of the country right now is a little under 35% is under the ZEV requirement. For example, of the U.S. auto market, 35% of cars delivered in the U.S. are to ZEV states. So the fact that somehow Virginia's on the sidelines of that does not sit right with where we are, in reality as a state. So I just think there's a little bit of lag time for policy to catch up, who we actually are.
Especially when you think about our survey results that,
right,
indicate over half of Virginians would consider an EV for their next car. To Lena's earlier point, they're going to go to Maryland and get that car, and Virginia's going to miss out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to add to those points, I mean, from my perspective, it's the climate that's setting the pace here. And this is something we honestly should have taken care of decades ago, and we're way behind. We're not the ones deciding how fast we should be going here. It's the atmosphere, and the atmosphere doesn't really care whether we have our act together or not. But in the meantime, the policies that we're talking about for EV adoption are only talking about cars that are being purchased. And there's a lag time built in there because not everybody is going out and replacing their car tomorrow. So any policies that we set in place tomorrow are going to take another, 10 to 15 years to be fully realized in terms of what we're seeing on the roadways.
I think the average age of a car on the road is 11 years now, something like that. That's a great point. We have a really good question from the audience. You guys talk about incentives and a lot of acronyms, ZEV, TCI, REGI. These are great policy solutions. How do we get past apprehension, misunderstandings, and lack of information when talking to everyday people? How do we make this easy and digestible and easy to understand?
You mind if I take this one first, Joel?
Please, yeah.
So something we do at Generation 180 is we work with everyday EV owners and we empower them. So Stuart and I can talk to everyone until we're blue in the face about electric vehicles. But if we're not your community member, we're not your neighbor per se, we're not your trusted messenger, it's not going to mean anything. You might not believe us. We can say, oh, they're cheaper to own, they're actually cleaner, there's more than only 2 models, we promise. But really seeing it firsthand, having those kick the tire experiences, learning from your neighbor who's also electric or also drives electric, about how easy it was for them, that helps a lot from my perspective to address those myths. And our research actually shows, thankfully, that increasingly Virginians more and more not only have a positive view of EVs, but also are seeing more information out there about it. But there's still a gap. There's still some 30 to 40% of people who we have to reach. So our work is by no means done. But, as we said earlier, owning an EV a lot of times cures your apprehension. And so, getting a test drive, helping make that as easy as possible, making them more accessible and not this big scary thing. Walton can give everybody test drives post-COVID.
That's a great answer. A lot of questions coming in. What is the tax incentive, the federal tax incentive? Is that going to expire? And why is maybe incentive a more equitable approach than that tax incentive? Can anyone speak to the federal tax incentive, what that is?
I don't want to talk too much, but I'm happy to, unless Walton wants to.
No, go ahead, Blair. Feel free.
So the federal tax credit, there's a difference between a tax credit and a rebate or a voucher. The federal tax credit for a certain number of vehicles sold per manufacturer allows people across the country to apply for up to $7,500 tax credit. As more EVs of that model in that brand are sold, that credit gets ratcheted down, as well as you have to have a high enough tax liability to qualify for that tax credit. So not everybody would qualify for a $7,500 tax credit or have a liability that high. And that's why the federal tax credit, while we're all grateful for it, it's been hugely responsible for supporting EV adoption rates across the country. It's not very equitable. Whereas a point of sale rebate that reduces the cost of the car right then and there, instead of having to wait until April 15th to file your taxes and then get that money back afterwards, you're reducing the price of the car right then and there. And so many people buy their cars based off of the monthly cost, not necessarily based off of the down payment. And so that's a huge difference. And when I say rebate, by the way, I absolutely advocate that needs to be a point of sale rebate. Having it be an after the fact rebate while it's slightly more equitable than a federal tax credit because it's not based on your income, it still doesn't help more people access the vehicle at that time by reducing the upfront cost. And also our federal tax credit, thanks to the current administration, was not renewed recently. So it is starting to go down. Now that might change under a Biden administration, I don't know, but really federal policy is fantastic, but state level policy can play just such a huge impactful role, and we need to be better leaders on that front.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good summary. What about, we've read in the news some really bold paths forward. California saying they're going to ban new sale of new internal combustion engines by 2035. I think Great Britain said something similar. New Jersey, someone introduced that. I mean, does that seem crazy, or is that the kind of bold policy proposals that we need? Anyone brave enough to take that?
I mean, do we need it? Yes. Can we secure that in Virginia at the state legislature in the next couple years? No. But we can secure the policies we're talking about so far on this in the meantime. But when you have these, leadership states like California, that absolutely has a trickle down effect. I mean, the U.S. automakers stand and take notice. We're all probably relatively aware that the automakers are moving in this direction anyways. That would certainly accelerate it and have a follow-on effect for other states, other ZEV states that have kind of sort of riding California's coattails a bit. You'll see some knock-on effects with that. and then you'll see more entities getting into the charging game to bring down the cost of charging infrastructure. So yeah, I hate to be the negative Nelly though about just being realistic about Virginia's legislature. The reality is legislators will tell you it's an election year. Which unfortunately in Virginia is basically every year. But in the case of the House of Delegates, it's every 2 years. So you're basically, you have, only every other year, according to that wisdom, can you be bold. I don't agree with that because I speaking to the demographics of Virginia, I don't see things, seesawing back and forth that much. But that's my initial take. I'd be curious what other folks think.
Yeah, I agree with Walton on that.
Yeah.
We need it, but it may not be realistic for Virginia. But I think it will be the case that at some point in the hopefully not too distant future, we will get to the point where nobody is missing a gas-powered vehicle. They're not going to say, "Oh, I just wish I could buy a vehicle that I had to fill up with gasoline, at the gas station." I honestly think people won't miss it. And so, is that going to be in 2035? It might be. It might be that, states like California saying no new sales of gas-powered vehicles in 2035. And by that point, people are saying, well, I wouldn't buy it anyway. We kind of don't know, but pushing that envelope and making those bold moves to accelerate that transition process is what's needed.
And I would just add, so this is kind of an interesting perspective that I'm going to bring. One, that those big policy pushes are actually strengthening legal cases right now to help those states in support of their ZEV policies. But more interestingly is there's studies that show how state level policy can kind of be a domino effect to achieving federal level policy, and that can actually work faster in a lot of ways. There's examples of this for voting rights and different types of reform, where once you hit X number of states who've adopted a certain policy, federal policy falls into line really, really quickly. And so even if Virginia, for instance, isn't going to be first in line for saying we're going to ban the sale of new ICE cars by 2035, if more of our neighbors do it, if we continue to knock on this door and implement ZEV and create more momentum towards that direction, we are going to continue building momentum for broader federal policy action as well.
A lot of questions about how long things take. And I think people, Lena said there's like a 2-year window for ZEV requiring the manufacturers, and people are looking for a little perspective. Like, for example, how long did it take to get the Virginia Clean Economy Act, to formulate it and get it through the General Assembly? Is it typical that things, we should be talking about it now because they take 5 years, or can you give people a little perspective on that? Anyone?
The things we're talking about are pretty darn off the shelf. ZEV is off the shelf. Literally, you're just riding other states' coattails that have adopted that standard, and you just go with it. Incentives are relatively off the shelf. You do want to design them well, of course. And there's the little matter of where does the funding come from? When you move into something
tiny matter.
Yeah, right. Where does the money come from? And there are things out there that you might be able to draw from, although, of course, right now, not necessarily because of the economic crisis or the economic effects of COVID. The Transportation and Climate Initiative is going to take a few years. I mentioned the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That took several years to formulate because it's a multi-state compact. You've got to do the sort of technical work to just know that it'll work. And function. So that's going to take a few years. But to answer the specific question, the Clean Economy Act, that was legislation that was written and passed in under a year. Again, that's dealing with power plants, so a little bit less complex. But that's a good example because where there's a will, there's a way. There was a sort of coalesce of it is time to finally address power plant pollution. We've been talking about it for several years. Here's the package. get it done, and boom, we're going to reduce 1 million tons of carbon pollution until 2050 when we get to zero. I can see after a couple years of this foment there being that similar kind of watershed kind of moment in Virginia as well, where you have that kind of all-encompassing policy. But in the meantime, it's like, let's adopt these off the shelf options while we can, even though in the case of ZEV, being realistic, it doesn't kick in until model year 2024 at the earliest. So people are right to raise the question of like, oh God, the clock is really ticking.
Speaking of the clock is ticking, we have time for 2 more questions. Excellent. We couldn't have planned that better, Walton. People want to know, we're talking about passenger cars for the most part. Is there things being done also about school buses and garbage trucks and delivery trucks? We've all been stuck behind a big diesel delivery truck that's kind of like smoking us out. So is anyone doing work on that, policies to get heavy trucks electrified?
Yes, there's more movement on the light duty vehicles to start with, partly because the technology is ready and partly because, as we said earlier, they're the biggest culprits in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. This summer, 15 states announced a memorandum of understanding to work towards an EV adoption for heavy duty and medium duty vehicles. So that would include all of those. Virginia was not one of those to sign on. We certainly hope that Virginia will be in the next wave of governors signing on to that MOU. I have to say it's not very binding. It has a lot of striving for this and striving for that, but it's a step. And just like there are these ZEV standards that can be adopted for light duty vehicles, there are similar emission standards that can be adopted for heavy duty and medium duty vehicles. And yes, we should pursue those too, especially from a public health standpoint. Those big polluting vehicles that you're talking about are more impactful in terms of their particulate matter pollution and their nitrogen oxides pollution that have much more in the way of health. We'll see much more in the way of public health improvement as we transition those vehicles to electric.
Thank you very much. Okay, lightning round. You each have just a few seconds to answer the final question. What makes you most hopeful about Virginia and electric vehicles? Blair.
I'm hopeful because we have so many EV ambassadors clamoring to do more. Sometimes in environmental movements, we have to explain to people, this is why this matters. And then we have to encourage them to go advocate for it. Whereas the EV owning community, people who are advocates for electric vehicle technology, they are the best advocates for this and they want to do more, they're ready to do more. And thankfully for all of us, they're already raising their hands to help us in January.
That's great. Lena, what are you hopeful about?
Ditto what Blair said, but I would also add, it sure makes me hopeful because EVs are fun to drive. And so we're not asking people to deprive themselves.
Yep, great. Walton, last word.
The flip side of Blair's answer is the enthusiastic reaction I get, which I'm sure people on this call are familiar with, of people who are so jazzed by my car. I mean, just it's constant.
Yeah.
And so if you have that built-in enthusiasm, I don't think it takes much more to get to the point of, well, now you just own an electric vehicle yourself. You were already jazzed about it. Now you have one too. I don't think it takes that much more to kind of turn the switch on to Lena's point. Like, yeah, oh, gas-powered cars. Yeah, why did we do that again? So that's what makes me hopeful.
That's great. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate you being on this panel. The hour flew by. Want to encourage everyone to go to Generation 180's website and download and read the Virginia Drives Electric report. Again, thanks so much for joining. There's a lot of great reasons to drive an electric vehicle: health, climate, jobs, innovation. They're fun to drive, as Lena said. So let's do what we can to get these cars in Virginia. So thanks, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thanks.
Thanks, y'all. Stay safe.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.